Okay, so new nationalism in the era of good feelings is where we are today. And I want us to just remember how we got here, which is the War of 1812. I mean, it's more than just that, but that's sort of the immediate effect, we could say, of the War of 1812 is this era of good feelings. And so in the United States, there's this surge in nationalism, this surge in patriotism. We did it. We feel like we legitimized ourselves as a nation in our own right in the eyes of the British. And so we are very proud of ourselves, even though, if you remember, we had the devastation of the burning of the White House and of Washington, D.C. In general. If you remember that story about Dolly Madison saving artwork from the destruction of the British fire that they set. We rebuild, right? We come back stronger. That's sort of the American mantra. So we are entering into this era of good feelings that is going to be led by President Monroe. So we are going to actually start today. And I'm going to ask you to think back to the market revolution, which is another thing that's going to lead us into this era of good feelings. Think back to the market revolution, and I want you to look at these innovations: steamships, roads, that would be the continued improvement and building of roads, including out west. Canals, remember the Erie Canal and its importance. The cotton gin, the factory system, interchangeable parts, telegraphs, railroads, and new banking systems. And I want you to take a few moments to think about how you would rank those innovations in terms of which is more responsible for creating economic change of the market revolution. I'm not asking you to tell me which one is not responsible, because they are all responsible. But which one do you think is most, and be able to have like a coherent explanation for why. All right, so we are going to watch a very brief, hilariously kind of embarrassing video to watch. I think y'all would say it was cringeworthy, but it's funny and it's informative. So let's learn a little bit more about James Monroe. Have your presidency charts out. For him, this is a really good time to fill in some of those blanks. So pause it, go get it, and then come back.
If the internet had been around in 1817, James Monroe would have been our most friended president. Even John Quincy Adams, who was considered a complete grouch, liked Monroe. So why was Monroe such a hot property? Well, it helped that ladies loved cool James.
Oh, James.
One Virginia socialite described him as tall and well-formed. In modern speak, that would be total hottie. Even Thomas Jefferson said that Monroe was so honest that if you turned his soul inside out, there would not be a spot on it. The extremely popular Monroe made it to the top of the A-list when he was elected the 5th president of the United States. Monroe had big plans for America, including making America bigger. His Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, convinced Spain to sell us Florida, after we had already invaded it. Americans were spreading out, moving west, borrowing money, and buying land. Everyone was feeling so good about Monroe's presidency that they actually called it the era of good feelings. It was like a national beach party.
When Monroe was president, everybody was feeling really, really great. Maybe it was something in the water, I don't know. But people were fighting less and less. The political parties were getting along more and more.
But the party ended in 1819. Remember all that money people were borrowing to buy land? Many Americans couldn't pay back the money they borrowed. Everyone panicked. Banks failed. People lost their jobs and their homes. And those good feelings soon turned bad. Speaking of bad feelings, Monroe's second crisis dealt with the issue of slavery. When the territory of Missouri wanted to become the state of Missouri, the country was divided. Should Missouri be allowed into the Union as a slave state?
The Missouri Compromise was an attempt to balance slave and free states where there would be one for one. If a slave state came in, a free state would have to come into the Union.
Maine was added as a free state, keeping the number of slave and free states equal. But America was now pretty much literally divided in half. Monroe's most famous accomplishment is the Monroe Doctrine. It states that other countries can't come to the American continent and interfere in politics or colonize our lands.
I do not like when people who are not my close friends get all up in my business. All right? I certainly don't want overseas powers coming over to the Americas and getting up in our business.
Monroe actually didn't come up with the Monroe Doctrine. Again, his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, did. But Monroe put it in his second inaugural address, and, well, it's not called the John Quincy Adams Doctrine. That would have been a significantly less handsome doctrine. Monroe was so popular that no one ran against him during his second presidential election, and he served 2 terms. And his poor, underappreciated Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, was about to have a hard time following Monroe's act. His administration would be a lot less well-formed.
Okay, so began the era of good feelings, approved the Missouri Compromise, and established the Monroe Doctrine, all during this so-called era of good feelings. So let's talk about this surge in nationalism that's happening. We've survived the War of 1812. We have the respect of other nations. A couple of important war heroes are going to emerge. Andrew Jackson, future president of the United States, remember the Battle of New Orleans. And then William Henry Harrison, also future president of the United States, remember the Battle of Tippecanoe. This is also going to be a time in which we see sharp Federalist decline. Remember the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, where some Federalists were advocating that New England secede from the Union because they were tired of, a Southern majority sort of being in charge in American politics, including the Democratic Republicans. It's obviously unsuccessful, but it brought them a lot of shame. And it drew popularity away from them. We're also moving west. We see more and more people move west. We have the surrender of Native American land, the building of a national market, something called the American system that we're going to talk about, a lot of factories being built during this time period. And remember the embargoes and the British blockade, it's going to force the United States to have to look at itself and say, like, if we have factories in New England, can we support, that's what the national market refers to, right? Can we support those just in the United States? Like, will people buy American-made goods? In the South, with the large agrarian presence, will that supply the nation, or do we still need to look to overseas markets? We are going to be talking about sectionalism versus nationalism. We're moving towards the Civil War and the revival of opposition. So the Federalists are definitely going away, and the Whigs are going to be a party that emerge to rival the Democrats or the Democratic Republicans. So we are, though, right now in the election of 1816, we have the emergence of the very popular, look at that map right there, Democratic Republican Monroe, and you can see the Federalists are not serious contenders at this point. His cabinet, James Monroe, is going to be John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, a very significant American political figure and another future president, William Crawford, and John C. Calhoun, who also, and brace yourselves, there he is. That's John C. Calhoun. He's also a very significant American political figure who will become more significant the closer we get to the Civil War. In 1817, Monroe sort of tours around New England, where he didn't have airtight support in some areas, and he called it a goodwill tour, sort of saying, like, I'm going to be everybody's president, as we would say today. And so that's where the era of good feelings, that's where the name comes from. James Monroe is considered to be the last of the so-called knee breeches president. If you think about the style of pant that men of a previous era wore, or they were sort of like tights or hose from their knee down, right? That's what those are called, knee breeches. So after that, we're moving into a little more modern era fashion, I guess. But it's also historically significant, moving away from the early days into the sort of mid period of American history, or early American history, I should say. He's also called the Teflon president because he's so incredibly popular. And even though there are bad things that happen during his presidency, we're going to talk about economic panics, depressions, even, he is not necessarily blamed. He's able to survive all of that. Bill Clinton was often sometimes referred to as the Teflon president, the comeback kid, because things just kept going his way over and over and over again. He's also part of this Virginia dynasty of presidents, right? Think about Thomas Jefferson. But we will be sort of moving away from this idea of a Virginia dynasty once we get to, like, for example, Andrew Jackson, a couple presidents from now, away from that crew. But he is part of it. There he is again. I did not warn you. There's just no good picture that exists of John C. Calhoun. I challenge you to find one. I've tried to put some up that are better, maybe, of a younger John C. Calhoun. I don't know. He's 18 in this picture. I'm just kidding. I'm not sure how old he is in this picture. But John C. Calhoun and another man named Henry Clay, it's going to feel like we talk about them forever. Like they don't go away. They don't die. They just are around through all season of American politics. Some key features of his years in office: he's going to have a protective tariff, the establishment of a new national bank. Jefferson, the bank had been allowed to expire, and it wasn't Jefferson, but under his leadership, the bank had been allowed to expire, and so he's going to bring it back. They're going to build road systems and canals, but he is opposed to using federal money for internal improvements. It's going to be a tension. So what that means is if it's a state project, he wants the state to fund it, not the federal government giving grants for it. He thought that that was not allowed in the Constitution. This is the presidential election of 1820. So you can see how we've moved again in favor of Monroe. So let me see if I can go back. There's 1816. There's 1820. He sweeps. John Quincy Adams will be president after this, but his margin will not be nearly as significant. This is a really famous political cartoon, and it's about something called the American system. And the American system is a really important term and idea for us to be aware of, and it's the brainchild of a man named Henry Clay. And Henry Clay believed very strongly in this. This political cartoon is sort of calling into question that confidence that he had. The political cartoon is called The Monkey System, or Everyone for Himself. That's Henry Clay standing there, and he says, "Walk in and see the new improved grand original American system." Each cage is also labeled. It says home consumption, internal, and improvement, or improve. It's from 1831. It's making fun of the American system, that they are monkeys. But these are different parts of the nation's economy. So here's my question. Before we get too deep into what the American system was, what do you think the group is most likely to oppose Henry Clay's American system, based on who you have in cages and based on what you know about the idea of a national market? Do you think it's A, Northeastern merchants, B, Southern cotton planters, C, Western manufacturers, or D, Republicans nationwide? So let's talk about the American system, and then I'll give you the answer. Maybe not. Okay, so the American system is this idea that we need to establish internal American trade, so to speak. It's pushed by Henry Clay. Even Alexander Hamilton had sort of endorsed it in its parts. It had three sections to it. It supported tariffs. So he wanted high tariffs because he believed that that would encourage Americans to purchase domestic goods and promote the growth of American industry. He wanted a national bank, so he wanted to reinstate the bank whose charter had been allowed to expire in 1811 because he thought that that would stabilize currency and trade. And also, he wanted to invest in infrastructure. So he wanted to expand and improve national infrastructure and help with internal transportation. He wanted to pay for those infrastructure improvements with tariffs. So now going back to our question, who do you think would oppose the American system? Northeastern merchants, Southern cotton planters, Western manufacturers, or Republicans nationwide? And the answer is B, Southern cotton planters. They would have had the least to gain and the most to lose because remember, Southern agriculturalists, Southern farmers, tended to be against higher tariffs in particular because it hurt them as they were trying to find a marketplace for their produce overseas. Things that are also going on during the Monroe presidency. And this little chart in the top right is sort of a good idea of a description of a protective tariff. A protective tariff is just a tariff that's so high that it protects American business because it encourages you to buy American. So they're using a bolt of cloth as an example. So on the top left of that graph, it says, or chart, it says in the United States, American-made cloth sells for $6 per roll. I think that is actually $5 per roll. The British-made cloth sells for $5 per roll. No, that is $6. I'm sorry, y'all. $6 versus $5. But the British-made cloth, once the tariff is added, is going to sell for $6.25. So that is going to be a 25% tariff of $1.25 added to the British roll. So what are you going to buy now? It was the previously more expensive American bolt of cloth, but after the protective tariff, it is the less expensive cloth. So, we've talked about the Second Bank of the United States and the idea of a protective tariff. You can see here the imports and the exports and what the embargoes in the War of 1812 do to that and how important it is to establish an American marketplace. So what is growing in the United States? The crisis of slavery and also the economy. For now, we're about to have a bust. And that bust is called the Panic of 1819. There are even some economic historians who say that this is actually not just a panic, but a depression. It's brought on because we have the sudden collapse of cotton prices and also land speculation. There are individuals who are purchasing land on credit, and then the banks are calling for the repayment of those loans. They want hard money, so I'm not going to sell you anything unless you can pay me in cash. I'm not going to extend you any credit, and people can't afford that. They can't afford to repay loans, and so therefore we have the Panic of 1819. Remember, there has not been a national bank for 5 years, and so what is going to pull us out of the crisis of the Panic of 1819 is ultimately going to be a lowering of tariffs in some respects, maybe not quite as protective, but also the establishment of this national bank. We are moving west. We have this factory system. We have, and also the expansion of slavery out west. This is where the Missouri Compromise is going to come into play. We have explorers like Stephen Long who are out there working to document the Great Plains, or what Stephen Long called the Great American Desert. There's a really interesting story about this explorer, Stephen Long. He was commissioned to help understand the best place to put marine hospitals, and the government decides they're going to build one in a place called Napoleon, Arkansas. And Stephen Long is like, this is a terrible idea. Napoleon, Arkansas is not in a good location because of the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers. Anyway, ultimately, he's right, and the hospital collapses into the river. And it's after his death when the entire town of Napoleon, Arkansas is swallowed by the river. So he does a lot of good work, but he's not always listened to. The Adams-Onis Treaty is also going to take place during this era of good feelings. This is going to be something that is really going to be, well, Monroe will get credit, but also Andrew Jackson, because Monroe sends in General Jackson to capture 2 Spanish forts in Florida. Now, the reason why is because the Spaniards were encouraging, allowing, helping, or just turning the other way. Why it happened, it's unclear. Native Americans and also escaped slaves. So we think of all slaves as escaping north, but a lot escaped south into Florida, Spanish Florida, and they were raiding southern settlements near that Spanish border. And so the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1821 sees Spain ceding or giving all of Florida to the United States. So we are growing even further. Let's see, sectionalism and nationalism. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. There is this question of how we should admit Missouri, slave or free. The Talmadge Amendment says it should be a free state. The Missouri Compromise, though, shows that, or ends up with Missouri as a slave state, but Maine added in as a free state. So a couple of provisions. Missouri is admitted as a slave state, and Maine would be a free state. This resolves that issue on your colonial maps where you had a giant Massachusetts. And number 2, except for Missouri, slavery was to be excluded from the Louisiana Purchase lands north of the 3630. So it essentially divides the nation in half by saying that slavery is allowed under that line. So all of a sudden now westward, well, not all of a sudden, but think of westward expansion as a contributing factor to the Civil War.
To understand what the Missouri Compromise is and why it's so significant in American history, we have to take it back about 200 years. Now, let me set the stage for you. The year is 1820. The U.S. is a young nation with 22 states, 11 free states in the north and 11 slave states in the south. But this balance is called into question when Missouri, a piece of land acquired from the Louisiana Purchase, wanted to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. Slavery was a highly contentious issue in the U.S. at this point. Some were pushing for the total abolition of slavery, while others looked to expand it. This issue pinned families and states against each other, creating a powder keg just waiting to explode. With tensions already high, the idea of Missouri entering as a slave state prompted heated debate in Congress, and throughout the nation too. Not just about Missouri, of course, but also how slavery factored into all future states and the future of the nation. Many argued over whether Congress even had the right to spread or limit slavery in the United States at all. While Northerners argued Congress should be allowed to prohibit slavery, Southerners insisted on popular sovereignty, the idea that it should be up to the states to determine this for themselves. These sentiments sound familiar? The biggest sticking point of the debate was political power. You see, Missouri's entrance as a slave state would throw off the balance of power in Congress. So to keep things even, Congress hashed out a separate solution, a compromise of sorts. In exchange for Missouri's admission as a slave state, the Northern Territory of Maine would be admitted as a free state. This ensured equal representation between the North and the South. A second part of the compromise banned slavery throughout the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of latitude line 3630. But while the Missouri Compromise limited the spread of slavery, it did nothing to abolish slavery in states that already had it. So while in some ways it staved off a civil war, it was only because it just maintained the status quo. The admission of Missouri as a slave state only fanned the flames of the national debate over slavery, a fierce disagreement that wouldn't be resolved until the end of the Civil War.
Okay. I also want to mention a couple of court rulings. The court and Native American tribes, we know Indian removal is coming a couple presidents from now with Andrew Jackson. So make sure you know the Worcester v. Georgia case and make sure you have that filled out on your landmark court cases. It essentially establishes a parental relationship or a guardian relationship between the U.S. government and Native American tribes that the U.S. government argues can't properly manage its own land or money. The Marshall Court, also down in the bottom left, Dartmouth v. Woodward, is really important. It does several things, but one of them is strengthening the contract clause and also limiting the power of states and their ability to interfere with private charters. And that really fits in with the broader theme of a federalist martial court. So even though the Federalists might be declining in power politically, they are still very much ruling from the bench here in the martial court. And we also have the Monroe Doctrine. It refers to these revolutions that are happening in Latin America. It's written by John Quincy Adams, but again, it's given not credit, but it's called the Monroe Doctrine. It's during his presidency, as the video at the beginning mentioned. He mentions it during his second inaugural address. It essentially says that the American continents henceforth are not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. So stay out of our hemisphere. If anyone's going to be colonizing Latin America, after these revolutions are over, it's going to be us. So it's not saying leave Latin America alone because they deserve to be free. It's saying leave Latin America alone. We don't want colonial powers too close to us. Which brings us to the corrupt bargain. So this guy is named John Quincy Adams. And the video that I showed you at the beginning of this conversation was talking about how popular Monroe was. John Quincy Adams, is not popular. He is just not popular. And I don't know why. Well, I mean, I do know why. He wasn't very friendly. He was kind of a cranky guy. And he wasn't like young and good looking like Monroe was said to have been. But what he is really good at is policy. Have you ever heard a politician described that way? Yeah, well, they might not be likable, but they're really good at their job. That's who John Quincy Adams was. He was someone who was good at being a statesman. He wrote the Monroe Doctrine. He is an important American political figure, but he is not like going to win a popularity contest. So we're going to see the election of 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And the corrupt bargain has to do with this idea that there is no absolute majority in the Electoral College. So because of the 12th Amendment, the presidential election had to go to the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives and also a political candidate, Henry Clay, is going to support John Quincy Adams. When John Quincy Adams becomes president, at sort of the urging of Henry Clay will become Secretary of State. This is dramatic because it means that Andrew Jackson will say, this isn't fair, you cheated. He will hate John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. And so they say he cheated. There's a lot of revenge that's going to go on. And essentially, we will eventually see a President Andrew Jackson. All right. So are there any questions about any of this? You just reach out, let me know, and I will see you guys again soon. Oh, there's the electoral and popular vote layout.